For more content like this, visit menaregood.substack.com. Men are good, as are you. Oh, yes, men are good indeed, and the two men I'm with today are especially good. I just love these two men. Stephen Baskerville and Rick Bradford both have just done so much for men's advocacy. It's hard to really to say enough about them. But let's look at each one. Let's see. Stephen. Let me read you this. Stephen Baskerville is a semi-retired professor of political science and history of almost 40 years. He writes on political ideologies and other topics, and for decades his work has concentrated on the politics of the family, sexuality, and the radical ideologies that have recently dominated it. He's the author of hundreds of articles and several books, most recently Who Lost America, Why the United States Went Communist, and What to Do About It. Yeah, and you can see Stephen's books there on the screen. Taken into custody, I think it was 2007, Stephen. Is that right? It was really the first book that outed the family courts as being just, and it still is a huge help. I reference it all the time and go back and look at this and that. It's just a fantastic book. Then Who Lost America is Stephen's book about what the heck happened and what can we do about it. Interesting. And how about Rick Bradford? Let's go to Rick here. Yeah, Rick Bradford, who writes under the pen name of William Collins, is a semi-retired engineer and theoretical physicist. He holds a degree in theoretical physics from Cambridge and a PhD from University College London, spent nearly 40 years working in the power generation industry, and now is a visiting professor, honorary senior research fellow in engineering at the University of Bristol. He turned in recent years toward blogging and writing about male disadvantage and gender issues. And he did. The book you can see there, The Empathy Gap, is a landmark book, as Stephen's also was a landmark book. But The Empathy Gap is a huge compilation of how men are disadvantaged. And it's just a wonderful book. If you haven't seen it before, check it out. And then Stephen's book, The Destructivists, is a book that's about what the heck, how did we get to this point, and what can we do about it? So all of these books are just wonderful resources and can be found. We'll leave links for the Amazon below, but also we're going to leave links to all of the AI, what would you call them, programs, where you can go to these different books and ask it a question. You can ask a question of the empathy gap. How many men were homeless in Great Britain or whatever, or Stephen's books too. And AI will read the book and give you back an answer. It's fascinating stuff. We'll leave those links in there also. But let's talk for just a second about how Stephen and Rick are actually similar. They're both academics. They're both men's advocates. They've both written groundbreaking books on men's plight, and both followed up those books with books on how we got into this mess and how we can get out of it. So what a team today to talk about this issue. And the issue we're going to talk about is father custody, the solution to injustices against men. Yeah, and the ideas we're going to talk about are here. Real quickly, father custody is the solution to both injustices of family court and today's larger crisis of the family. It's very practical to achieve, and by breaking the feminist power, it will go a long way toward rectifying the other injustices against men. Those are the three topics that we're going to hit. Stephen's going to start, and he is going to look at these three. Then when he finishes, Rick is going to go over those same three, and then we're going to open it up to discussion. So let's see. Stephen, you want to get started?
Yeah, well, thank you, Tom. First of all, I'd like to start out by thanking you and saying that I'm greatly honored to be interviewed by you again, because you yourself are not just an interviewer. You have written, your Substack and other works, and you yourself are an enormous figure in the fathers and men's movement. So, don't sell yourself short.
Thank you, Stephen.
And of course, I'm very honored to be on with Rick Bradford today, who's I'm familiar with his work. And I don't know that we've ever met in person, but I would sure like to sometime. Next time I'm in Blighty, Perhaps we will, but no, his stuff is great, and
Mm.
I look at this as kind of a friendly debate. I'm throwing out. I for a long time I've criticized the men's movement for a lot of complaining. Some of the complaining, a lot of the complaining is good. I do it myself, and we need people who document, who inform us and document about what is going on, the injustices in
Yes.
for fathers specifically and men in general. And Rick is one of the best, and there's some others. So I don't mean to sell anyone short for that, but I think at some point we also need to start thinking more and more about solutions. And I myself was the president of a fathers group for 2 years, so I know that we've tried various things, political action, creating organizations. A lot of it just doesn't work. But I have this idea, it's not my own, which I wanted to put forth. And that's the idea of father custody, which people have pushed for years. And I want to argue that it is the solution to the injustices of the family court and the larger crisis of the family, that it is a very feasible policy option. It can be achieved um, by various means. And number three, it's also will greatly facilitate the larger injustices against not just fathers, but men generally.
Hmm.
And therefore, I think we should make this our number one priority if we're looking for solutions and not just complaints, but positive, constructive action. We should focus all our attention on this, or the preponderance of it, and the other problems I think we can work out more easily.
Hmm.
So number one, father custody as a solution to the injustices of family court. I think it's fairly obvious. Most of the overall, mothers are also the victims of injustice in family court occasionally,
Hmm.
but overwhelmingly the victims of it, the injustices, are fathers. Um, I think that the when I say father custody, I'm really being a little bit provocative here because I don't think it should be father custody in all circumstances, regardless of the way the father has behaved. If a father behaves egregiously, gives grounds for divorce, is clearly guilty of, you know, proven guilty of child abuse by, due process of law and so forth, then, there can be exceptions. But I'm arguing for a rebuttable presumption of father custody. And basically, it's the same thing as arguing that uh, the guiltless parent, the parent that is left behind, should have custody of the children, all else being equal, and if that parent is not guilty of egregious violations. So, since in most cases it is the mother who files for divorce, it is the mother in most cases who moves for the divorce, even if she doesn't file. And you often hear that women file 70, 80% of divorces. I believe, and I have documentation for this, and I'm not the only one who says this, that when it's mothers, when children are involved, mothers file virtually 100%, or the moving party in virtually 100% of divorces.
Wow.
So father custody is really basically
Huh.
the same thing as saying abolish no-fault divorce, because if you're talking about a guiltless parent keeping custody of their children, his or her children, then that would apply to mothers as well. Now, why
Hmm.
is this desirable? Well, it's the least intrusive state intervention into the private sphere of life, the private family life. You're basically saying that a guiltless parent, a guiltless citizen, has a right to be left alone in his home, in his dwelling with his children, without any state interference. Um, Now, is a party who has filed for divorce or given grounds for divorce not equally guilty? No, they violated a legal agreement. They violated a legal contract, and therefore they are not. And if they are insist upon violating that contract by deserting the home and the marriage, then they are not guiltless, and they can leave by themselves, without by his or herself, without with the clothes on her back. I'll use the feminine gender, and that's the that's those are the consequences of deserting your family. Those and deserting your marriage, is you leave the children behind, and the parent that's there guiltless. Now, the alternative that most often put forth is shared parenting, or what's used to be called joint custody. I agree that joint custody in some cases is appropriate. I think, for example, if the parents are not married, then you don't really know who's abrogating the marriage because there is no marriage. So for guilt for unmarried children who've had parents who've had children out of wedlock, then perhaps shared parenting might be the default position because again, it's the least state intrusive. It allows both parents to have a stake in children that they created jointly, but both of them are in a sense a little bit at fault at least because they haven't made a lifelong commitment in a marriage before they had children. And I can show, I won't go into the details, but in English common law and the Napoleonic Code and other legal codes, it is marriage that creates fatherhood for precisely this reason. Fatherhood is created not by blood tests, not by sperm donors, but the father is the man who is married to the mother, because the mother's motherhood cannot be disputed. It's known. It's fatherhood that needs to be proven. And in the law, Lord Mansfield's rule, it was marriage that created fatherhood. So marriage, in other words, creates paternal rights. It creates parental rights for both, but especially it creates paternal rights for the father. So a legally married father who is given no grounds for divorce, who is deserted by his wife, should get sole custody of the children and have no interference whatsoever in the way he chooses to bring them up.
Right.
That's from number one. We know that joint custody, shared parenting does reduce the divorce rate. This will reduce the divorce rate even further if that is our goal, as it should be. As for point number two, I've advocated this and other people have advocated this for years. We've never been anywhere near achieving it. Even shared parenting is difficult to get through legislatures everywhere. It hasn't done very well. Even when it gets through, as in the District of Columbia, where I used to live, it is not enforced often. So I don't put a lot of stake political action. I have to admit, I've tried it. I was head of a fathers group for 2 years. It's very difficult to work to achieve anything. And today, as far as I know, there is no viable parents or fathers group that really has a remote chance of achieving either shared parenting, let alone father custody. So what is the leverage that would allow us to get it? Very simple. It is the MGTOW phenomenon, the so-called marriage strike, which many people have noticed on the left, on the right, in the center. The most thorough documentation of it is Helen Smith's book, Men on Strike,
Right.
published 2010, I believe, or 2015. Nothing's changed. People were noticing it even before that basically men know about, as they've realized what the injustices of family court, the horrific injustices and flagrant violations of not only the U.S. Constitution, but the English Constitution, the common law, which is the basis of constitutions throughout the Anglophone world, and the equivalent in other democracies. As men discover these, they simply refuse to marry. It's as simple as that. Not surprisingly, and people are tearing their hair about this. Feminists even don't like it. Traditional conservatives are just tearing their hair out about this. They scold men, they excoriate them, they attack men for being puerile and sissies and unmanly. And who started this? That woman, Kay Himowitz, wrote a book about this. She started this. And then most recently, Tucker Carlson did an interview with Matt Walsh where they both land into men who refuse to marry. They don't land into the family courts for their injustices, but they land into men for refusing to marry. Well, it's very simple. If women want men to marry, and there's evidence that they do want this, they need to join men and get rid of these laws. I mean, they can enjoy the power if they want to of getting sole custody, but the men aren't going to go along. They're just not going to subscribe to these rules. They're just going to walk away and refuse to marry. So there's good evidence that women, sensible women, mainstream women, even some feminist women, want men to marry men and have children and families. And if they want this, they're going to have to not only, they're going to have to join with men and add their voices to the men's voices for reforming the marriage and custody and divorce laws so that men are not subject to these horrible injustices because the cat is out of the bag. Young men know about this. It's not like when you and I were young, Tom, or the three of us, I guess, were young,
Right.
when we were blindsided by all this.
Right.
Young men today know what they are up against, more or less. If not, they can read my book. But they, they're boycotting marriage. So it's very simple. If you want men to marry and to have children with, you better join the men. And once the women join in, I think the laws will change very fast, very fast. I think once the women start adding their voices to the men's voices and say, these laws are ridiculous, then I think the laws will change. So that's my prescription. Father custody. By the way, I didn't credit Daniel Amneas, whose book, The Case for Father Custody, is a classic, another classic, I should say, in the and I owe a lot to that book, and we all do. So I highly recommend that book. Daniel Amneas, The Case for Father Custody, published in 1999, I believe.
Yeah.
That's the prescription I endorse, and the marriage strike and using that as leverage to bring that about is what I believe is the way we would achieve that, get those laws enacted, changed, reformed, enacted relatively quickly without building a lot of organizations or legislatures or going through litigation and legislation and all that. I think we just get the women on our side, and I think the laws will change very quickly. Now, the third proposition, I don't know. Do you have any quick comments about that? Shall I talk about the third one? The third point in our debate tonight is the most difficult, I have to admit. Shall I start on that? I will. I'll talk about it a bit, and we can go to because I realize it's the most contentious. It's the one that's most difficult for me to prove, and that is, will father custody alleviate or end the other injustices against men, such as the many injustices that Rick outlines in his book,
Right.
The Empathy Gap. I think it'll go a long way. I think it'll go a very long way toward alleviating or ending those. Why is that? Well, I think the custody abuses, violations are by far the most serious of all the injustices against men. I think the taking away there's nothing more unjust or cruel or inhuman than taking away their children. I think we can all understand that at a gut level, and nothing more cruel than a child to take a child away from his or her father.
Right.
We all understand that. There's tragic literature written about that, and it moves us all to tears. Most men would gladly, or at least readily, endure the most gruesome physical punishment in preference to having his children taken away. So I think it's by far the most serious injustice against men, against the most cruel. I think almost all but would it end the others, or would it alleviate the others? The ways that I think it would is, first of all, it would do a lot to break the back of feminism. Amneas argues this. He argues that the feminists, it's one of their earliest victories, was no-fault justice back in the 1970s, even before Roe versus Wade. It's one of their highest priorities. They've been pushing for it throughout the 20th century. Since the 1940s, they were drafting this legislation. Before they were drafting abortion, before they were pushing legalized abortion. And I think it would do a lot to break the back. And I think almost all the injustices against men are the result of the radical feminist or the mainstream feminist movement. And I think it would do a lot to break that. What Amneas argues, and I endorse this, is the main power of feminism is control over the reproductive system, the power to control reproduction and children, the reproduction of the society and children. That's why abortion is so important to them and why they so want abortion. And it's why they wanted no-fault divorce so early on. And they actually achieved it long before they achieved no-fault divorce. They had it de facto for decades. It didn't appear magically in the 1970s. So this control, the old, as the poet said, the hand that rocks the cradle is the hand that rules the world. And controlling, nothing terrifies men so much as the fear that their children will be taken away, that they'll be they'll be summoned to court, and their private life will be ransacked, and their, not only their children, but their home, their savings, their income, their salaries, everything is subject to confiscation by the courts, and they are left des destitute,
Yeah. Yeah.
not only penniless, but often homeless, and often increasingly even incarcerated. And incarceration almost always leaves them homeless afterward. Anyway, so this is by far. I won't go into the details of the different ones because Rick goes into them in his book, but I think it'll do a lot toward alleviating these other injustice, and it'll make them easier to rectify. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll listen to what Rick and you have to say.
Good. So
Well,
we'll
that's a
turn it.
great presentation, Stephen.
Yeah, yeah. Fascinating. Rick, we'll turn it over to you.
Right, well, that's going to be hard to follow.
I'm with you on
Um,
that.
we, were- we were originally envisaging a debate format in which I'd oppose a motion, I suppose, but I mean, that was never going to happen because there's going to be a great deal of agreement between us.
Yes.
Certainly not enough disagreement for a debate format, but um, I suspect there will be some differences of view emerging. But let me say straight away, in terms of the key proposal that Stephen has put on the table is father custody, or to achieve father custody via the marriage stripe concept. Now, I'm bound to broadly agree with that because a few years ago I actually published an article proposing exactly that.
Hmm.
I even had a mantra that went along with it, which was uh, no marriage, no cohab, no babies.
Yeah.
And that actually immediately highlights one comment I have on Stephen's presentation. And by all means, Stephen, interject with points of clarification whenever you like. You'll be doing me a favour to prevent me going into a monologue. But yeah, it's not just about divorce. It's divorce. It's not just about marriage and divorce. It's about cohabitation and children being born outside
Yes.
wedlock.
Yes.
In the UK now, the majority of fatherlessness is actually driven by parents who are never married, not by divorce.
Hmm.
Although divorce is a major contributor as well.
Hmm.
So you've got to take that on board, and it would be the marriage strike would be rather pointless if people then just cohabited and had children in that arrangement anyway. So it would have no teeth. So
Hmm.
I anticipate probably Stephen will agree with that um, by way of a clarification. The other I think the other um, point that needs making is that fatherhood and marriage go hand in hand, and Stephen's already made this point that the purpose of marriage, the very purpose of marriage, is to create fatherhood. I mean, it would be interesting
Hmm.
to do some sort of survey asking people what is marriage for and see what sort of answers you get. But I think these days people tend to think of marriage as being a lifestyle commitment type thing. It's about them, it's about the adults. But of course, that's not its purpose. You can have amicable arrangements between different sexes without marriage. So marriage is actually the purpose of marriage is actually to create fatherhood, and Stephen's absolutely right. Um, and so this brings me to my spin on this. And it's important, the other thing I should say is important, despite the fact I'm broadly agreeing with the marriage strike type concept, it's important to acknowledge, and again, I'm sure Stephen would agree with this really, that we're actually pro-marriage, right? This is why the analogy with the strike is perfectly accurate, because of course people that go on strike, they do want to work, they just want better terms and conditions.
Right.
And so
Precisely.
the marriage strike is about, yeah, we want to get married, but we want the right terms and conditions. Thank you very much. Because what we've been palmed off with now is not real marriage. What we've been palmed off with now is a hollow sham. And that really is the problem. And this is why it is inappropriate for the establishment conservatives that Stephen alluded to, haranguing men for not getting married. Actually, I would put this in a very stark manner. They can't get married. It's no longer possible. Certainly not in English law, because what's available in English law, it does not meet the requirements for marriage. So what is real marriage? I mean, this is the issue then. I would say there are at least two major characteristics of real marriage. The first is that it should be a solemn, not just a contract, but virtually, and in fact, preferably literally a religious, solemn covenant between the two people, which no man may put asunder. In other words, permanence is a key aspect of marriage. Okay. So already I feel I'm probably losing sympathy with some of the audience, but I don't aim to be popular. I just aim to tell it like it is. That's one of the key aspects of real marriage, and the other one, of course, is what Stephen has essentially alluded to, which is it creates fatherhood by that process. So a real marriage confers a secure relationship with the man's children. And this has been destroyed. I mean, one could write a whole shelf full of books on just how feminism has, first of all, espoused the destruction of the family in their pursuit of destroying the patriarchy, and how they've actually achieved it in detail. And I'm not going to try and do justice to that. It would take up too much time. It's worth just one quote, because I think this is everything turns on this one short quote, and it's taken from and this is English law I'm talking about. It's taken from the 1989 Children Act, which was very much the brainchild of Baroness Brenda Hale, although she was, I think, then just plain Mrs. Justice Hoggett. This was her brainchild, this whole act. She's a former feminist academic turned judge, and eventually she became the most senior judge in the land, the president of the Supreme Court. And this line in the legislation read, the rule of law that a father is the natural guardian of his legitimate child is abolished. From that point in 1989 onwards, everything else was a mopping up operation for the feminists. That was the killer blow. And it's that needs reversing. It needs reversing in law, but it needs reversing in so many other ways as well. So I agree with what Stephen says in terms of the time for complaining is over. Okay. Despite the big fat books I've written that are essentially full of complaints. I was never complaining on my own behalf, by the way. I've said repeatedly that I'm one of the lucky ones. I've never suffered from any of these disadvantages, actually. I've not been mangled in the family courts. I've not had false allegations or domestic abuse. I'm not an educational failure and so forth. I'm one of the lucky ones. And actually, I've always thought that put me in a stronger position for advocating for men, because it is demonstrably not a selfish action born of having a chip on my shoulder.
Right.
So that's made it easier for me in that way. But nevertheless, it's time to stop that. It is, of course, right and proper to point out the facts, the empirical evidence. There's nothing wrong with doing that. But it was never very manly to be complaining. And it is absolutely the time to start concentrating on positive action. So again, I'm very much in agreement with Stephen on that one. So where do we go from there then? I mean, I would observe that when we did have real marriage, which we did have just about within my lifetime, it was protected by the triple lock. Because it does fatherhood does have to be protected socially, because it is a social institution. And again, Stephen has already alluded to this. Motherhood is secure in biology, but fatherhood is not. Fatherhood is created by a social institution, which is marriage. And it was protected socially by what I call the triple lock. And the triple lock was that it was protected in legislation, in law. It was protected by social expectation, and in particular, the social disapprobation. In fact, the social stigma attached to, it's specific actually to sex outside marriage, and certainly having children outside marriage. And finally, the third part of the triple lock was religious teachings. And those three things used to be very much a coherent whole which protected fatherhood in the way that it needed protecting. And the feminists have taken advantage of the fact that fatherhood is socially instituted, because it makes it vulnerable. It makes it vulnerable to cultural attack. And that's what they've done. So you can see this aspect of feminism as being essentially a form of bullying, because their own parental status was secure in biology, and they were attacking those for whom that status was vulnerable. So when the secure, the strong attack the vulnerable, that is bullying, I would say.
Yes.
So that sort of puts my spin on the suggestion. I'm broadly in favour of it, but there are problems, and the problems come in the practical aspect. So this sort of now moves me to the second question, really. What are the practical issues associated with achieving this? I'm not so sanguine as Stephen as regards how we can bring this about. The point being here that the marriage strike is sort of already happening. I mean, he alluded to the marriage strike, and that, I think it is about 15 years old or something, that book. And so it was already happening then, and it's a great deal worse now, because the issues are that much better known by the general public. So we've already got men not just not getting married, but turning away from cohabitation as well, and even turning away from dating because of the horrors of dating apps and the fact that many men can't even afford it anymore. So that the effective strike, which was never an organised strike, of course, and still isn't, has in fact got more common. But I don't think I certainly don't think the powers in the land really care. And so far, although, I mean, what Stephen looks forward to is the women getting on board, but the women aren't going to get on board unless it gets even worse. And there are natural limits to how bad it will get, because the attraction men feel for women is very strong. And although feminism has done a jolly good job of overcoming it for some men, there are limits to that. And I think we might have reached it. So, as I say, I'm less sanguine that suddenly women are going to come on board and somehow that's going to magically transmute into a change of legislation. My own favourite actually is and this is where it'll sound negative, but I don't think it is really. I think it's just being realistic. And you have to be realistic in order to be realistically positive, I would claim. I'm always a proponent of culture before politics. The politics is downstream of culture. again, this may be somewhere where Stephen has a different view, and by all means, we'll get to airing that later. But I think we're in the realms of culture first here. And at this point, I really do have to allude to the bigger picture of what's happening in our societies, because whatever we put forward as a suggestion in this particular context, the context of it's fatherlessness we're really trying to address.
Right.
Sorry, I've just got a pop-up comment which I'll get rid of. Yeah, in order to address it, we have to be realistic, and we have to look at what else is happening in the culture, because these changes won't happen in isolation. There are other major changes in the offing, and without wishing to be too apocalyptic, you can put forward a strong case to say that we're looking at the decline and possible extinction of Western culture.
Right.
When I first started saying that a few years ago, even I thought I might be going over the top. I no longer think that, because I live in England, and frankly, it looks closer than ever from here.
Yes.
So we have to take on board that there are these other changes happening as well. That's going to make it a lot harder for these sort of issues to get a look in, actually. But that doesn't mean they're not important. Actually, I think it means they're even more important. Because if we do, and in the case of the UK and increasingly other Western countries as well, it's not just the social unrest issues, which are all too evident in the demonstrations we're having in this country, but it's also the economic issues. I mean, frankly, the UK is an economic basket case right now. It's quite terrifying. So something is going to give, and it might be tomorrow. You know, it's not going to go on much longer, and we have to take on board the reality of that when we start trying to extrapolate into the future on these issues. Now, what that means to me is that if we're looking at some sort of social collapse, which we might be, I don't look forward to it, and I wouldn't want to hasten it, but being realistically, we may well be going there. Then actually family and local community become of paramount importance. One of the things that's happened over the last 50 years under the influence of not just feminism, but the broader progressive movement, is social atomization. Social atomization is the cause of a lot of our woes, actually. But we can't afford to be socially atomized when the chips are really down, when when suddenly you can't get your money out of the bank, and suddenly the supermarket shelves are empty, and it begins to seem like Stalinist Russia all too really. In that case, family and local community will be the only thing that keeps you going. So these issues will become actually not less important, but more important, but part of that bigger picture. And I apologize if I seem to be going off on a wild tangent here, but I do feel strongly that if you don't take this on board now, then you're not being realistic. And it may be because I'm in England, in Keir Starmer's England at the moment, which concentrates the mind, let me tell you. So that brings me to what I would put forward as possibly a more realistic mechanism for achieving the same ends that Stephen and I are both trying to achieve. And that is via culture and via specifically encouraging the formation of local communities to start actually living the sort of life we want to live, which means to some degree seceding from the main culture. Now, this is difficult, of course, but it's not impossible. We know it's not impossible, again, in England, because, frankly, the Muslims are already doing it. They live by Sharia law in their own communities already, actually. the law of England is of secondary importance to them. So they are already doing it. And there are other instances around the world. I guess the Amish in the US might be an example. So you can do it, I mean, within limits. And that's perhaps what we've got to start to do. And did I emphasize that the marriage strike doesn't mean we're against marriage? It actually means we're pro-marriage, but pro-real marriage. Right. So I would not advocate for telling men, even now, not to get married. They just have to be aware of what I've said in terms of real marriage doesn't really exist. So you have to be extra specially cautious about your choice of partner. You have to be concerned with doing the best you can to ensure that the woman of your choice is aligned with your values, which means if you're going to enter into this commitment of marriage, we're going to treat it as it used to be before divorce became so common. You're going to have to enter into this with the idea that this is permanent. This is a solemn covenant that we're making, preferably before religious authorities. But certainly between the two of us, we've got to accept that's the case. And the man has got to try and be reassured that a few years down the road, when, not if, but when things get rocky, she isn't going to bail out and take the kids with her.
Right.
I mean, there has to be. This is very much a second best, because, as I say, these things should be secured within the triple lock, which means there's laws and external authorities like religious authorities piling in to ensure that the father's children are not taken of them. But in the interim, we have to start living it, I would say. We have to start living it, and that demands a degree of trust and extreme care in your choice of potential spouse. So that's my suggestion. And these local communities, by living this this view of what marriage should be for life, and it does convey secure and permanent fatherhood. So the purpose of marriage is to create fatherhood. The purpose of stable marriage is to create stable fatherhood, and the purpose of permanent marriage is to create permanent fatherhood. That's the issue. In order to enforce that, even within a local community, I'm afraid we have to go back to the bad old days of stigma, because stigma for people who step outside the accepted social norm is the way that society has of telling them they've done wrong and discouraging them from doing wrong in the first place. So we've got to stop being frightened of stigma. It's the liberal, or the so-called liberal mindset that has educated us into thinking that stigma is wholly bad and only wicked old conservatives would go there. No, I'm afraid if you're going to have a firm commitments, then revoking those has to be policed by society, which means stigma, and ultimately it should be policed, of course, by the state in the form of laws, which means the marriage contract would become a contract again, because in England, the marriage contract there is no contract. It's not a contract. Since 2022 in England, you can divorce unilaterally. All you've got to do is one partner notifies that the marriage is irretrievably broken down. No evidence is necessary. No argument is necessary. No reason is necessary. You don't even have to tell your spouse that you've applied for a divorce. He or she will only find out with 6 weeks to go before it's final. And it can't be contested anyway, so they lose nothing by not being told. It's absolute shocker. I mean, that's not a contract. The whole essence of a contract is it ties two parties into arrangement which neither can unilaterally withdraw from.
Right.
That's the essence of a contract.
Yes.
That's not what marriage is. It's not a contract anymore, but it should be. So that's my suggestion. The sort of in terms of practical sort of advice to young men, given that we're supposed to be about practical measures. One is be aware of these issues and be extremely cautious about your choice of potential wife, that she must be aligned with your views in the way I've outlined. Yes. And involve the parents in the good old-fashioned way, because who knows, they might just be wiser than you. Secondly, be a gentleman. Read Stephen's book on how to be a gentleman. It's a cracker. And that means be polite. And although you have to be forceful in these issues, in the sense of making your views clear, it doesn't mean being obnoxious.
Right.
Be the very opposite of a troll. And seek a local community. You might find one ready-made in a religious community if that's your thing. But again, be extremely careful. Most churches in the UK have become hyper-liberal. The Church of England is dead in the water. Even many of the Roman Catholic churches have gone the way of all flesh. So you have to be extremely cautious. I don't know about the non-conformist churches, they're a mixed bag. So be very, very cautious about that. But religious communities are probably the best ready-made community. Other than that, you're looking at forming one from scratch, which is difficult. But having the support of local community is going to be crucial in the future, in my view. And finally, on the third question, I would just dismiss it, Stephen. I think you're worrying about nothing there. Just because a solution to a problem is not the solution to every problem is no reason to reject it. That would be absolutely stupid. Anyone that thinks there's one solution to a whole bunch of problems is being unrealistic anyway. And as again, you've rightly said, what the issue we're addressing now is by far the most egregious and most important to be addressed. So if we have a way forward on that, my goodness, that's a win I'm going to take. And the other issues can wait for another day. So don't worry about it. I've said enough, I think.
Indeed. Stephen, you got any questions for Rick?
Well, thank you, Rick, especially for some of those clarifications, because some of those details were helpful. Of course, the marriage strike, as you indicated, is not only must be, but has been spontaneously a matter of withdrawing from having children. It's not just marriage, but even having children in cohabitation out of wedlock. And you're also right about the dishonesty, really, of the tradcons and the scolding that they do of men who don't marry, because, as you say, marriage doesn't you can't marry anymore. It doesn't exist. In fact, one tradcon, Maggie Gallagher, wrote a book a few years ago called The Abolition of Marriage. And she argued that the no-fault divorce, the abrogation of marriage as a legally binding contract, effectively amounts to the abolition of marriage itself. If it's not binding in the law, it doesn't matter. It's not marriage. And then I noticed in later years after she wrote that book, she's kind of backpedaled and doesn't press the issue anymore. I quoted mostly the title, because the title is in some ways the best part of the book, The Abolition of Marriage. But that's absolutely right. You cannot do it. And really what I'm advocating is the same thing. Father custody really is nothing more than, and the abolition of, if you want to put it this way, the abolition of no-fault divorce is really nothing more than simply making marriage a legally binding contract, which it must be. It has to be, or it's not marriage. It must be legally binding at a minimum, legally binding in the law. Now, on top of that, it could be, and it should be, as you say, a sacred covenant, depending on whatever religious community you belong to. Um, and I would argue, I would also point out for the many people, because I know they're in the UK, the decline of Christianity is even more advanced than in here in the US. Or, sorry, I'm not in the US, but than in the US. But one thing I've pointed out in my books from time to time, and I would like to, I might write another book on this. This might be the next book, are the many things that Christianity has done to preserve marriage and to preserve harmony among the sexes. And in particular, I would argue the civic role of churches is extremely important. Not just even if you don't believe in it, even if you don't believe Christian doctrine, the civic role of churches is enormous. For example, it is the fact that churches have withdrawn as the adjudicators, basically the informal, non-political adjudicators of family difficulties. In other words, the mediators, the therapists.
Right.
At one time, churches were the therapists, the mediators, the adjudicators
Right.
of family crises. And it is the withdrawal of the churches from that that has allowed the legal profession to move in and to take control, the lawyers, the judges, the courts. And unlike the churches, because for the churches, having to deal with people's marital disputes was a bit of a nuisance. They didn't get paid anything for it, extra for it. It was a lot of trouble. So that gave them an incentive to solve the problem, to knock their heads together, to make, to get people to behave themselves and to honor their marital vows. Whereas the lawyers, by contrast, have the opposite incentive. They have an incentive to make the problem worse because, of course, they make money. The churches were basically, and the congregations, not just the clergy, but the congregations, were basically amateurs, which is what all good citizens are, is amateurs. They do it out of the sacrifice of their time and sometimes their money. And so you have when that's the case, you have an incentive to solve the problem. When you professionalize those functions and pay people to sort out marital disputes, of course, they have the opposite incentive. They have an incentive to make the problems worse.
Yes.
And that includes lawyers, judges, psychotherapists,
Yep.
And the whole entourage of hangers-on that derive a living from family breakdown and hang around the family courts. So that's so never sell religious communities short, even if, as you say, and it's undisputable, most of the churches, and this is very true in the West, in the U.S. as well as Britain, and everywhere in the Western world, most of the churches are useless. They're feckless. They don't do their jobs. They might have impeccable theology in theory, but they don't apply it in practice. And they, well, just to take this current example, if most men, if you go to a pastor, a Protestant pastor or Catholic priest, and say, look, you married me under these terms, and the state has come along and ripped up the covenant, which you said was sacred. What are you going to do about this? Well, does that priest or that pastor, do they go into the courtroom with you and say, we have standing in this case. We consecrated this marriage. We led these people to believe that this was a lifelong vow. We assumed that it would be a binding contract in the law. We have standing. You have no right to dispense injustice to this couple and their children. We demand that you enforce this contract, this covenant, not the covenant, not the religious covenant, but just enforce the legal contract, and make sure that justice and not injustice is dispensed in this case. Is that what churches do? No. They say, well, to the man who complains about the injustice of the courts, they say, well, we'll pray for you and maybe we'll help you find a lawyer. So this is, I mean, if you can't trust the churches for your marriage to help you sort out your marriage, including dealing with the injustice of the state, if you can't trust the churches to do that, then what's the point? It's hardly an accident that people don't go to church anymore. Yeah. Even believers don't go to church. I mean, devout Christians who believe the gospel, who believe in the doctrines of Christianity, they don't go to church either, because the pastors and the congregations have become feminized. The pastors and priests have become feminized. In many cases, it's his wife who's the real power in the church, and they don't have the courage of their convictions. So it's hardly surprising that they are people are. I think it's the single most important thing in the decline of Christianity in the West. I think if they showed some spine, some backbone in enforcing the marriage covenant and contract, they would. I think they would find the pews might start to fill up again. Now, the one thing I would push back on a little bit is I'm not quite as optimistic as you are about the power of culture, about our ability to change the culture. I think there are some instances where a legally binding contract we must insist upon. For marriage must be a legally binding contract, or it effectively doesn't exist, and you can't rely on it. Now, I know that you may not be aware of this in the UK, but this is especially true in the US, where these tradcons, traditional conservatives who scold men for not marrying, they are also the ones who refuse to do anything about the legal abuses, the corruption, the legal decline of the family courts. And why is it that they refuse to do this? Well, their excuse is, well, we first have to change the culture. So I'm not accusing you of this for a minute, Rick, because you've shown guts all the way through this. But I think this becomes an excuse for many people to do nothing, including those whose job it is to criticize the abuse of government power. People like journalists, scholars, media people, clergy, I would include all of those, have a historic role, a role which at one time they fulfilled historically, of criticizing the abuse of government power. And those are the very people that are not doing their job. The journalists, the scholars, like, in my profession, our profession, the journalists like, at the best journalists like Tucker Carlson, for example, the media, including the alternative media today, and the politicians, of course, even the good politicians like MAGA and the Trump administration, and the Attorney General, and all of the figures in this administration simply not doing their job. And the excuse they often give is, well, first we have to change the culture. And I think that's often because you can always change the culture. You can spend your life changing the culture and achieve nothing. And there's a nice quote.
Can I just come back on that? Because that's a spin on it that I wasn't aware. I wasn't aware that change the culture was being used as an excuse by some people. But and let me clarify. I mean, I certainly agree that the objective needs to be legal change. I mean, there's no question about that. The marriage needs to be a contract again. It needs to be legally enforced. So, and as I say, what we really need is the whole of the triple lock reinstated, of which the legal part is one key part. So it's not a question of not agreeing with that. It's just a question of which comes first. And the other issue is I certainly don't need, in fact, not only I, but a dominant lobby now actually within England doesn't need convincing that the establishment conservatives are not going to deliver for them. And I don't just mean on this topic, but I mean on anything. Right. We've just, a year ago, we came to an end of 14 years of conservative government in the UK, during which time they relentlessly pursued liberal policies. And finally, we saw through that. And the last election, the last general election, the priority of people like myself who had previously voted Conservative was not to try and get any party into power, because I think by then we'd accepted that the Labour Party was going to get in. The objective was to give the Conservative Party the biggest kick up the arse we could possibly deliver, The mantra at the time amongst people like me, and there are a lot of us now, was zero seats for the Conservatives. We didn't achieve that, but we certainly did decimate them, to the point where I don't know where they are standing in the polls now, but I think they're in third position after Labour, with Reform on top, of course. It is Reform voters, of course, I'm talking about here, and fellow travellers of Reform. So, yeah, I mean, the issue of the failure of the establishment conservatism is mainstream accepted within England now.
And I would just add to that too that this is happening throughout the Western world. I mean, the traditional mainstream parties of the right and the left are increasingly discredited. Both the Labour and the Tories in Britain, the uh, the Democrats and Republicans in the United States. Look at the situation in France. The traditional parties, the Gaullists, or whatever they call themselves now, uh, and the left are discredited, and people are deserting them for for Le Pen's Rassemblement. I would say yes, this is happening everywhere, and but I think even these protest parties, these populist so-called parties, are also, I think they're stalling. I think they're becoming a bit I think they've achieved a lot, but I think they've only achieved so much. I think the Trump administration is very badly stalled in its domestic agenda, especially. And I think the Farage in the UK has, again, I think he's achieved a lot, but I don't think he's grasping some of these issues that we're
No,
raising. And I
I
think
agree. I agree with you. I agree with you.
somebody who achieves these, who has the courage to take on, I believe personally, I believe that the gender issue, broadly speaking, and I don't just mean transgenderism or homosexualism, but feminism, so-called mainstream feminism. I think this is the biggest crisis. It's certainly the biggest ideological shift in our lifetime.
Right.
Is the shift on the left, the renunciation, basically the renunciation of doctrinaire Marxism and doctrinaire liberalism and doctrinaire socialism, and the decline of those, and then the rise, the replacement, the displacement of them by feminism, by sexual politics. That is the main, within even the lifetime of the three of us. That is the biggest ideological shift, and nobody's paying attention to it. I think this whole woke ideology, I think a lot of this is diversionary. I think it's camouflage. I think within the woke agenda, I don't think anything in the woke agenda is remotely as important as the sexual dimension. It's the big one. It's the one that is undercutting society everywhere. And it's the one that the politicians, including the populists, MAGA and Le Pen and Farage, don't want to touch.
Yeah, I agree with. If I
So,
can just immediately come back on that, I agree. There are limitations to these protest parties. As you say, the Farage has done wonders in bringing reform onto the lead in the polls, but he's not the panacea for all our ills because, as you say, he's limited in his scope, and it's still the case generally, as you quite rightly point out, that the gender issue is not being grasped by anyone. They don't want to go there, and yet again, we're very much in agreement that this is key to everything. And because they don't want to go there, this just redoubles my concern that we're facing a collapse. Because I don't see anyone that's going to solve this problem. Well, even if I don't see anyone in politics that's going to even make this the central issue it should be.
Right. Right.
And even if they did do that, they would then have the mountain to climb to solve it. They're not even going to acknowledge it. And so it's certainly not going to be solved. And since that's the main problem driving our social division and increasingly economic meltdown,
absolutely.
this is why I alluded to where we're heading. and it's people do accuse me of taking the black pill of despair, but it isn't that. I mean, I'm not despairing personally. I mean, we still live in a vibrant culture despite all our problems. We still have the richest culture that the world has ever seen, and in talking about local community, what I'm really espousing is somebody's got to salvage as much of that rich culture as possible with a view to a future renaissance. And we're talking some generations down the line. I've never thought things would get better in my lifetime. And now I think on a time scale of, as J.D. Unwin would have it, 3 generations, which is about a century. And you can't foresee in detail what's going to happen on that timescale. But what you can do in the present is accept that probably we're looking at something catastrophic, and being prepared to hunker down and salvage as much as you can. And part of that will be strengthening your local community by having the cohesion that only stable families and clear social rules, not liberal laissez-faire, do as thou wilt, but firm structures within which to work. Now, only that will survive through what's in front of us. So yeah, I anticipated, Stephen, you would not be so keen on the culture first approach. I think we've probably crossed swords on this one in the past to a small degree. I still think it's
well. There is one way.
Yeah, sorry.
There is one way I think the culture could assert itself, and that would be if the religious figures, if the religious leaders would show some spine. And I think I think I echo your statement. You said that it's easier to join a church than to start a new organization, and I think that's very true. I don't think churches. I have a very low opinion of churches nowadays in the West, but they are, it's easier to rejuvenate them than it is to create wholly new organizations. Secular interest groups, pressure groups, political parties, they have limited efficacy because they're always based on someone's political opinion. The religious groups, and broadly speaking, Christian ones, Jewish, Muslim, I wouldn't rule out by any means. These are well organized entities which have enormous potential. When you think about it, the United States was founded by churches. It was as churches that the religious dissenters of the 17th century left Britain, England, and came to New England as entire churches. They settled New England towns. Those churches became entire towns, and those towns their worship services became participatory democracy. The town meetings. And meanwhile, these same religious dissenters back in Old England were creating a civil war and the first revolution in modern history. So, one of the things about Christianity is it does have endless potential for revivalism, to rejuvenate itself, no matter how moribund how it becomes. So I wouldn't write off, even if you're not a believer, I would never write off churches, Christianity, religious belief generally, because if you want to rejuvenate there's many people who believe that if politics is downstream from culture, culture is downstream from religion, from recult. So it's something to think about, and I wouldn't dismiss it too quickly.
Yeah, I see a meshing of both ideas. Stephen's idea of talking the women into understanding that marriage needs to be different, and Rick's idea of building communities. I mean, to me, those two work together. If you have a community that's set on marriage being a certain way, that's going to talk women into it automatically. And that's going to happen as a result of the community itself. And what better way to talk women into something than to have a community tell them? I mean, to me, that's a
Yeah.
very powerful way to change women's minds. You're not going to do it individually, I don't think. So I just see a blending, a mesh of both ideas working together, you know?
Yeah, it's a very good point, Tom. Yeah, it's not going to, it's going to have to be a large scale.
Yes.
But it doesn't have to be everyone. But, again, nobody, Rick points this out too. The marriage strike, nobody wants it to be indefinite. Nobody wants it to be forever. An indefinite strike is a revolution,
Right.
and it inevitably fizzles.
Yes.
It's not, we want to preserve marriage. We want to restore marriage. Uh, that's something else, by the way. I would send a message I would send out to men out there. Men's rights, MGTOW, and Rick made this point, but I would like to emphasize it. Um, don't abandon marriage too quickly. I think men. The point is to restore it. I think a lot of men have been too quick to abandon traditional institutions and have therefore acquiesced or aided their own destruction. These institutions were built over centuries,
Hmm.
largely under male leadership, marriage, churches, um, and other institutions of society. And men can, if men built them, men can restore them. And I
Hmm.
wouldn't,
Hmm.
I would question rejecting the institutions of the past when they're still there and they can still be rejuvenated.
Interesting. Interesting.
Yeah, one of the rather obvious things is people will object to the sort of vision we have of where we want to get to as being unrealistic, but you can immediately squash that one because actually it's what we used to have and we
Yes.
moved away from it. So it's clearly realistic. You just have to have the will to get there,
Yeah.
and you have to sustain that will. I would argue over some considerable time, certainly multi-generational, in order to get there. It's not a quick fix. Um,
Hmm.
Feminism has worked remarkably quickly. It's gone from nowhere to world domination in my lifetime without fighting any wars or winning any ballots. It's been
Yes,
quite
that's right.
impressive. If
Amazing.
only their aims were laudable rather than reprehensible, they would probably deserve a medal. Uh, the efficiency
Absolutely.
with which it's been carried out. But of course, they had the massive advantage of going with the grain because everything was about, well, it was aligned with gynocentrism, Tom. I mean,
Exactly.
that gives it wings immediately.
Everything. It's
And
downhill battle, baby.
in terms of its relationship to the broader liberalism, well, liberalism's degenerated into libertinism. And so who isn't attracted if as long as you haven't got the strength of character to resist, who isn't attracted to the idea of, well, just do what you want, and damn
Hmm.
the consequences, which is essentially what liberalism has become. It's, but
Yeah.
it's no great surprise that that approach to things is disastrous, and that's what we see. It's
Hmm.
our social meltdown as a result of that. And yeah, again, Stephen's quite right in pointing to the centuries these arrangements took to develop
Yes.
under the guidance of the Christian Church, largely in the West,
Yep.
and in order to create social stability and harmony. And if you take a working system, a complex working system, and make a random change, it's almost certainly statistically going to make it worse.
It's true.
I would just I would just add one point, and that is, as you say, Tom, the remarkable rapid ascendancy of feminism, and I think largely that has been the corollary to that is the abdication of men. The men, women didn't do it on their own. We allowed them to do it,
Correct.
and I think we need to. We're not going to persuade the world one at a time. Men need to take the initiative. They need to be bold. They need to act like men again. I'm not saying we should start a revolution as such, or that we should created authoritarian governments. But I think men need to be a little less timid, in fact, a lot less timid,
Yes.
and seize the initiative and, exercise their testosterone and use it.
Yes.
Well, whilst, of course, being a gentleman.
While being a gentleman. They're not mutually exclusive.
Indeed. Indeed.
The other thing that we must allude to, I think, to be fully honest about this, is that I'm afraid if you're a ne'er-do-well, lazy layabout, good for nothing, don't expect any woman to be particularly attracted to you. So it is the case now, and it always was the case, and it always will be the case, that if you want to be an attractive proposition to a potential wife, gentleman, then you better make something of yourself. I mean, that's just the law of the jungle, and there's not going to be any nobody's going to overcome that one.
It is indeed the law of the jungle. It's amazing how almost every mammal population, the males have to compete. And they have all these fascinating different ways to compete to try and get the girl. And we're no different. We're no different,
It doesn't mean you've got to be an obnoxious alpha male or a CEO or rolling in money. It's not as coarse as that. There are other ways.
Yes.
And this idea of success is very multifaceted. There's many different ways of being an attractive proposition. And not all women as mercenary as is sometimes made out. Although it's only sensible of women to want to marry a man that earns, if anything, a bit more than they do. Because whether they do this consciously or not, they are thinking of what happens when I have children and I can't work for a while.
Sure.
And
absolutely, they have to.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, that's a good idea on their part.
Great, gentlemen, the ball is in your court to make something of yourself.
Yes.
That's the way it is.
Yeah.
Indeed.
And what works on the personal level with women, the assertiveness, the achievement, the sense of accomplishment, that's the same thing that's going to work on the political level. So you might as well do it, and it'll improve your personal life and it'll improve our society. So you might as well adopt this. We're all too feminized, all of us.
As a matter of fact, I wrote a post that went up today about that. The idea of looking at how we've been shamed, looking at how we've been taken away from masculinity, and standing in that and stand up with it, because that's what we've got to do. We're being called to do that. Just as you gentlemen have been called today to speak your truth. And boy, do I really appreciate it. It's been a great time. It's been fascinating to hear you both talk about this and with the ideas you have. And thank you very much for what you've done. And I think unless you've got more to say, I think we're about finished. Or anyone have something to add?
The only thing I'd add is that this is about practical advice, and hopefully you can dig it out from there what the practical advice is. I mean, people can start. When I say people, I mean particularly young men of marriageable age can actually start thinking about these issues of how they're going to select the right sort of woman and what sort of community do they want to live in.
Yes, good. Stephen, any final words?
No, just thank you both for taking my thoughts, my proposition seriously, and helping me debate it and refine my ideas. So.
Thank you for using and for bringing them here. And also, we're going to leave the books from Rick and Stephen linked below to Amazon, and also the links to the AI version so you can ask questions. And good. Men are good, as are you, and we'll see you on the next one. Thank you both. We'll see you then. Men are good, as are you.